as the F1 circus headed south from Canada to Mexico, over in South Africa, the legal frameworks enshrining apartheid were being dismantled. The Population Registration Act, which since 1950 had required all citizens to have an official racial classification given at birth and affecting almost every aspect of their life, was repealed, but as the opposition African National Congress were keen to point out, this was more symbolic than anything, and that the last battle would be the big one, a new constitution that would give everyone the vote, including all 30 million black citizens, 68% of the population, who had been disenfranchised up to this point. President de Klerk was clear, though, that that was what he wanted, and was confident an agreement could be reached. In a referendum back in March, the people of Russia had voted to establish the office of president, and in June the elections were held. The two main candidates were Nikolai Ryzhkov, Gorbachev's preferred candidate and a good party man, and Boris Yeltsin, an independent candidate who had been elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet at the same time as the referendum. Yeltsin had been outspoken about his opposition to the glasnost and perestroika reforms, and he had a personal animosity with Mikhail Gorbachev as well, and was a fierce proponent of Russian autonomy within the USSR. The result was very one-sided, with Yeltsin winning 58.56% of the vote to Ryzhkov's 17.22%, and he would take office in July with Alexander Rutskoy as his deputy. On the day before the Mexican Grand Prix, an enormous volcanic eruption took place in the Philippines. Mount Pinatubo in central Luzon had been simmering for the last year or so and catastrophically blew its top, sending an ash cloud 25 miles, 40 kilometres, into the atmosphere, sending lethal pyroclastic flows blasting down the mountainside, destroying almost everything within a 30-kilometre or 19-mile radius. Seismologists of the US Geological Survey had been keeping an eye on things, and evacuations in the days before the eruption are calculated to have saved tens of thousands of lives, but 847 were killed and 10,000 left homeless, while the ash wrecked local agriculture, changed the weather, and permanently altered the geography as valleys were filled with the huge amounts of solid matter ejected from the mountain, which in turn shrank to a relatively tiny caldera. It was the second most powerful eruption of the entire 20th century, behind only a 1912 eruption in Alaska, and was 10 times more powerful than the famous 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. And on the same day, the Indian general election, occasioned by the fall of Chandrasekhar's government back in March, ended. The size of India necessitates a multi-day election. Chandrasekhar's coalition had collapsed, but the previously dominant Indian National Congress wasn't quite able to capitalise fully, becoming the largest party but not winning enough seats for an outright majority. P.V. Narasimha Rao became the new Prime Minister, the first from southern India and the first not to speak Hindi as a first language. He promised economic and financial reforms which he hoped would head off the predicted economic crisis, but getting anything done in a minority government would be as difficult as always. And so to Mexico, where the race itself was in some trouble. Although it still attracted plenty of spectators, and there was a capacity crowd this year as usual, sponsors were increasingly staying away from the lucrative hospitality suites. Bernie Ecclestone confirmed, though, that the event had been renewed through to 1993 at least. The teams weren't necessarily happy to hear it. The high-altitude circuit, meaning the engines are gasping for air and about 20% down on power. Mauro Forghieri described it as basically a Formula 3000 event. And just like in Sao Paulo, the pollution and poverty, as well as the ever-present risk of the old Montezuma's revenge, meant nobody really enjoyed the trip outside of the racing either. John Barnard had at least got out of the trip by quitting Benetton, who recruited Gordon Kimball, formerly of McLaren and Ferrari, and JB's old right-hand man. Over at Brabham, meanwhile, the owners had replaced Dave Price as manager with John McDonald, the M in the old Ram team, and Yamaha had made some improvements to their engine. Predictably, the British motoring press had been going for Mansell in the weeks between races, and Riccardo Patrese was allegedly asking, not unreasonably, why he was still number 2 exactly, given his performances relative to Mansell so far, while L'Equipe was reporting just before the race that Alain Prost wanted to drive for Williams, which led to him having to hastily reassure everyone that he was committed to seeing out his contract with Ferrari through the end of 1992. He was still open about his problems with the 642 chassis, but Ferrari were working on a new one, the 643, which they hoped would be ready for the return to Europe to improve their competitiveness. Meanwhile, Ayrton Senna had been home to Brazil for a break between races and had fallen off his jet ski and given himself a bit of a cut on the scalp. There was nothing to worry about, but his appearance with a big dressing on his head certainly got tongues wagging once journalists noticed. With most teams coming straight from Canada, there was little development done on the cars, though Richard de Vila had made some changes to Guyar's Fomet 1 chassis, which the Fonmetal team were hoping would get them out of pre-qualifying. Stefan Johansson was still in the footwork, and Jackie Oliver had proclaimed himself very disappointed by Caffey's unprofessional behaviour, not to say downright dangerous. But there was talk that Bernd Schneider could return to the team at the next race if he could get out of his current commitments, while Johnny Herbert would continue at Lotus for the time being. The LaRousse team were here, but without Gerard, who was off in Japan desperately trying to drum up some sponsorship, amid news that the team's Ford engine deal had been pulled for 1992 due to lack of payment, and that the team mechanics had been told it might be wise to dust off their CVs. People were saying that there was a good chance that the team wouldn't see their home race in a month's time. Frank Williams and some of his staff nearly didn't make it when an important part fell off their private jet mid-air and they had to divert, arriving a day late but in one piece. Friday's early pre-qualifying session was hit by a downpour, which made things interesting. Leto still top of the standings, followed by De Cesaris, but Olivier Guyard third and praising the new car to the high heavens, and Nicola Larini fourth, a fillip to the team after their recent struggles until his rear wing was judged to be slightly too high and he was disqualified, which rather got Gasho off the hook. So with Chavez actually going faster than someone for a change thanks to Pirro having a spin, but still 6.5 seconds off the pace, the top four reported for qualifying proper. Bertrand Gachot had a big off on Friday, picking up a puncture on the notorious Peraltada and red flagging the session for a while, and then Senna made him feel a bit better by doing exactly the same thing, only without the puncher. He was just pushing too hard. Patrese meanwhile pushed through a bout of Montezuma's revenge to go fastest, with Mansell second and Senna third. About half the grid improved their times on a changeable Saturday, with Modena second fastest on the day, but 8th overall as Patrese dominated to take pole again, with Mansell once again alongside, 0.28 seconds behind, and Senna third for the second race running. Alesi took a fine fourth for Ferrari, followed by Berger and Piquet on row 3, Prost back in 7th, but then he'd won here last year from 13th, so you never know, alongside Modena's Tyrrell. Roberto Moreno was 9th alongside Olivier Guyard, who had frankly stunned the entire paddock by parking the Fonmetal in the top 10, just ahead of De Cesaris and Marc Blundell enjoying the new iteration of the Yamaha. Martin Brundle's copy of the new engine had some electrical problems and he had to use the old one and would start from 17th. Bernard and Suzuki were 18th and 19th, and Gachot lined up 20th ahead of the two Leighton House cars, with the two low-tide 24th and 25th, Johnny Herbert making his first start of the year. Michele Alboreto dragged his footwork onto the grid despite a bout of the flu, and despite the Porsche engine being stricken with an oil surge problem, particularly in Peraltada, but Stefan Johansson, never the greatest one-lap qualifier even in his heyday, was back in 29th, sandwiched between the two AGSs, with Eric Comas missing out by an agonising 0.05 of a second. It was Alesi's turn to exit the circuit at high speed on Sunday morning, but he was likewise fine to take the start, and the car hadn't been as badly damaged as it looked either, and he was able to start in his race car. The skies on Sunday were cloudy with rain threatening. The surface in Mexico was so dusty and uneven and treacherous in the wet that the stewards had decided that if it did rain during the race they would red flag the whole event, bring everyone in for tyres and then do a restart once everyone had their wets on. Goodyear had shod all of their runners in C compounds which they thought ought to go the distance, while the Pirelli runners were split with Piquet and the Tyrrells on the harder GF22s and Moreno and the Brabhams on the softer GF9 compound. Mansell would start in the spare car after his usual steed sprang an oil leak which the team couldn't locate in time, and then the cars all lined up, but an over-enthusiastic Marshall saw a puff of smoke from the back of Leto's Dallara and started waving the yellow flags, so the start was aborted and round they went again. And then at the second start, Olivier Guyard started waving and Ronald Brunscherider scrubbed the start again, having the Fonmetal pushed to the back of the grid, though an aggrieved Olivier protested that he hadn't stalled, he'd seen Blundell behind raise his hand, but he was deemed at fault and had to start from the back, which was a real shame for him after his great qualifying. Alboreto's car wouldn't start at the third time of asking, and he would have to start from the pit lane, though he was starting from the back anyway. Third time was the charm, as Patrese got away a little slowly, having trouble finding a gear again, and Mansell went by into the lead. A wide track and long lead into the first corner saw them go 6 wide at one point, allowing Alesi to leapfrog his way up into second place ahead of Senna, Patrese, Berger and Piquet, with Modena 7th and Prost 8th, Moreno 9th and De Cesaris 10th. Senna pulled out to take second down the main straight as the second lap began, crowding Alesi over but nearly losing the place again as a feisty Jean jinked the other way, aiming for the inside of turn 1 until Senna blocked him. Behind them, Modena had got past Piquet to go 6th, while Prost had dropped back to 10th, and De Cesaris was up to 8th past both him and Piquet. Mansell was pushing hard, but Senna wasn't letting him go anywhere, while Patrese was challenging Alesi for third place, which he took at the end of lap 2. Berger was already a long way behind those two in 5th, his engine not sounding healthy and clearly holding up the following pack of Modena, Piquet, De Cesaris and Moreno. But not for long, as his engine let go at the end of lap 5, leaving the Austrian having completed a grand total of 18 racing laps over the last 3 races combined, and his misfortune also took out Pierluigi Martini, who unavoidably hit the oil Berger had dropped on the Peraltada. On lap 11, Patrese had caught right up to Senna and pulled out, dragging the McLaren down the main straight and taking second. You don't often see Senna get overtaken fair and square on the track, never mind with as little fuss as Patrese did here, and he wasn't done yet, steaming up to the back of Mansell and starting to look for a way past. Frank Williams had been asked before the race if there were team orders, and he'd said no, absolutely not, that he's not in the business of deciding races with a coin toss, a reference to the 1989 Paris-Dakar rally in which the Peugeot sport boss Jean Todt had tossed a coin to decide which of his 2 rival drivers, Ari Vatanen and Jackie Ickx, would take the win. Certainly Patrese had been saying all weekend that he was here to win and had been looking focused and determined in between trips to the loo all weekend. He was all over Mansell in the infield sections, while Mansell was able to pull away a little on the straights. And behind them, Alesi was stuck to the back of Senna's car too, and went back up to third on lap 13. Modena was 5th, De Cesaris 6th and Piquet 7th, while Prost was way down the order, struggling with the handling of his Ferrari. At the end of that lap, Patrese made a move, and both Williamses went side by side down the straight, but Mansell had the inside line, and in a cloud of tyre smoke from both cars he kept the place, but only for a corner or two as Patrese used his momentum to take Mansell through the Moises Solana complex and take the lead. And now Alesi was right behind Mansell. Did Nigel have a problem? Well, yes, actually, his engine was ever so slightly overheating and a bit down on power, but not as big a problem as Alesi had because his clutch was sticking. No sooner had he got past Mansell off-screen than it stuck and threw him into a spin, dropping him to 9th. So as Patrese started to pull away from Mansell, the Red 5 Williams now had Senna right on his gearbox, with Piquet taking 4th off Modena just behind him, and De Cesaris following through a lap later, and Prost retired with a misfiring engine on lap 17, by which time Guiart and Gugelmin had also already fallen by the wayside. Mansell now began to pull away from Senna, who had his old rival Piquet right behind him in the Benetton and looking to get past, fresh off his win in Canada and having seen Patrese and Alesi both get past Ayrton in previous laps. And Martin Brundle meanwhile had pitted for tyres, but his right rear hadn't quite gone on right and fell off in the S's, pitching Martin into the sand trap on lap 20. So the order was Patrese leading Mansell now by some 7.2 seconds, then another 3 seconds back to Senna and Piquet, with De Cesaris 5th, Moreno 6th, then Alesi, Leto, Gasho and Blundell in the top 10. Patrese was still charging too, setting a series of fastest laps, and now carving his way through the back markers, passing Nakajima with almost nobody else in sight. Meanwhile, a bit of a train had developed behind Senna and Piquet, with De Cesaris, Alesi and Moreno, the Ferrari having got past the Benetton off camera a couple of laps earlier. On lap 29, De Cesaris ambushed Piquet to take 4th off him, and Alesi tried unsuccessfully too, which prompted Nelson to pit for new tyres despite running the harder Pirelli compounds and not having planned to stop. It was a cracking stop, but still dropped him to 8th behind Gasho and ahead of Bernard and Blundell, who were battling fiercely off-camera for 9th. Mansell had come to overtake Nakajima himself and been balked a little through the infield, which allowed Senna to close up again, and both went past on the start-finish straight, as Senna also tried to pull the same move on Mansell that Prix had pulled on him, going wide into turn 1 in order to get the line for turn 2, but Mansell chopped him off decisively, and while the cameras were watching that, Alesi got past De Cesaris again into 4th. Senna was all over Mansell around lap 34, just over half distance, and tried the same move at the end of that lap with the same result. Next time he tried the inside just to keep Mansell on his toes, as Alesi closed on the pair too. Patrese meanwhile went past Blundell and Bernard as he began lapping into the top 10, while Mansell and Senna approached the two Loti, running together near the back to lap them for a second time. And right behind them were Alesi and De Cesaris, still hard at it and leaving Moreno behind. Senna dropped back a little to take a breather as the dark clouds loomed further, while further back, Piquet had finally got past Gachot and into the points because Alesi had trailed in to retire, his clutch finally having given way entirely, and now Senna was back on Mansell's case again with De Cesaris just 8 seconds behind the McLaren in closing. Piquet's charge came a cropper on lap 45 when his left rear wheel bearing failed. He kept it running round to the pit lane, but the left rear wheel wouldn't go on the misshaped bearing, and he was out. It was about 2/3 distance now, and Mansell's engine seemed to have sorted itself out, so the Englishman put the hammer down, left Senna behind, and took the fastest lap, and shortly afterwards Moreno pitted. Unfortunately, his radio had stopped working and he couldn't actually tell him he was coming, and in the circumstances the 7.59 second stop was a pretty good effort by the crew and only dropped him behind Gachot, meaning the Jordans were once again 4th and 5th, which would delight Eddie Jordan even further. So Moreno was 6th, and the last man unlapped, Bernard and Blundell now 7th and 8th, Suzuki 9th, until his gearbox jammed and sent him spinning into retirement, so it was Morbidelli 9th, and Boutsen 10th. Hakkinen and Herbert were cruising along together in 11th and 12th, while the Tyrrells were both right at the back after having all sorts of tyre problems and both needing multiple stops. Mansell was now catching Patrese at a second a lap, getting the gap down to 18 seconds with 15 or so laps left to go, as Gachot suffered a similar fate to Suzuki, a gearbox failure that left him stranded in the sand. No double points finish for Jordan this time, and Eddie no doubt looking on nervously as an enormous forklift appeared to take the car away, but it was great news for Eric Bernard, who thus went up into the points. Mansell broke the lap record as Patrese came up to lap Moreno with 12 laps to go, as Blundell coasted to a bitterly disappointed halt from 7th, and it was starting to look like it might yet be a close finish, with some pundits wondering if it was Patrese's turn to have some minor car trouble, or if his illness had drained his stamina. Soon Mansell was in view down the main straight, 7 seconds behind with 7 laps to go. Mansell went quicker than his qualifying lap. Down came the gap. Patrese spent a lap getting past Herbert, 5 laps to go and 5 seconds between the Williamses. Then Mansell took his time with the Lotuses, and the gap only came down to 4.5 seconds with 4 laps to go. Patrese blasted past Nakajima again, and the gap was 3.3 with 3 laps left. Patrick Head and the Honda boys were talking about something animatedly in the garage, reported the TV crews. And now Mansell, with 2 laps to go, was within a few car lengths of Patrese. The last lap began, 1.148 seconds apart with limited places to pass. Mansell just couldn't get close enough in the end, and Riccardo Patrese took his 4th career win, nearly collecting a cruising Boutsen who'd slowed right down to avoid having to do another lap. Frank Williams and co would be delighted with a fantastic 1-2 finish after all their woes so far this year, while Ron Dennis and McLaren would not be happy at all, Senna trailing in nearly a minute behind the Williamses. De Cesaris picked up another 3 points for Jordan, Moreno salvaged 2 for Benetton, and Eric Bernard took what might yet be a vital point for the troubled LaRousse team, with Morbidelli, Boutsen, the Loti and Tyrrells the remaining runners. So, jubilation for Williams, and if Mansell was disappointed not to be the one on the winner's step, he didn't show it. Unhappiness for McLaren, where both Senna and Dennis were open about the V12 Honda just not being good enough, and depression at Ferrari with a double retirement for the second race running. Patrese overtook Piquet and Mansell overtook Prost in the drivers' standings, with Williams taking second from Benetton, after being the first team to get a 1-2 finish in the new point system and got 16 points rather than 15. There was now a month before racing would resume at the brand new Magny-Cours circuit in France.